Have you ever watched someone smile at you while they were already deciding you didn't belong in the room? That's a particular kind of smile. Warm on the surface, but if you've been around long enough, you can feel the cold underneath it. I felt it the first time my son in law shook my hand at Sunday dinner, 4 years before any of this happened. I told myself I was imagining it. I was wrong. My name is Josephine Audette. I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years as a financial analyst for a mid-sized investment firm in Ottawa, and I retired early enough to still have the energy to do something with what I'd saved. I'm not telling you this to impress you. I'm telling you this because when my daughter came to me asking for money to open a restaurant, she knew exactly what she was asking for. She wasn't asking a woman who would hand over a check and look away. She was asking someone who reads loan agreements the way other people read novels. The restaurant idea started the way my daughter starts most things, with enormous passion and not quite enough preparation. She called me on a Tuesday evening in late October 2 years ago now, voice bright, talking fast the way she does when she's already decided what she wants before asking. She had found a space on Preston Street. She had a concept. She had a chef she trusted. What she didn't have was the capital to make any of it real. She didn't ask for a specific number that first call. She talked around it the way people do when the number feels too large to say out loud. She talked about the neighborhood, about the menu, about how this part of Preston had been quietly growing, how 2 new condos had gone up nearby, how the foot traffic would only get better. I listened. I let her finish. Then I asked her what the lease cost, what the build-out estimate was, and whether she had spoken to anyone about food service licensing in the city. There was a pause. Not a long one, but long enough. Her husband answered for her. He had been on the call the whole time, I realized, listening from the background. He jumped in then, voice smooth and ready, as if he'd been waiting for his cue. He said they had a strong vision. He said the concept was tight. He said the right investor would see an opportunity here, not just a risk. Investor. That was the word he chose, not family, not mother. Investor. I didn't say anything about that choice. I simply asked him to send me whatever they had put together in writing, and I told them both I would look it over before we talked about numbers. The business plan arrived 2 days later. It was polished. I'll give them that. My son-in-law had worked in marketing before this, and it showed. The branding was clear, the photography was beautiful, the tone was confident. But I've spent 3 decades reviewing financial projections, and confidence without math is just decoration. The revenue assumptions were aggressive. The expense projections were light. There was no contingency column, and the funding request, when I finally found it near the end of the document, was $180,000. I printed it, I sat on my kitchen table with a pen and a legal pad, and I went through every number. I made notes in the margins. I circled things that didn't add up. By the time I finished, I had a full page of questions and a very clear sense of what this plan needed before it was ready to be funded by anyone, let alone by me. I called my daughter the next morning and asked if we could meet. Without her husband, she went quiet for a second, then said, of course. We met at a coffee shop near my house. She came in still wearing her coat, cheeks flushed from the cold, looking like she had been rehearsing something in the car. I set the printed plan on the table between us, my notes visible, and I watched her eyes move over my annotations. She didn't get defensive right away. That surprised me. She leaned in, and for a while it felt like the conversations we used to have when she was in university. Two people with different amounts of experience trying to understand the same problem from different sides. I missed that. I hadn't realized how much I'd missed it until we were sitting there again. I told her the plan had real potential. I meant it. The concept was good. The location was good. She had chosen wisely on both. But I told her that if she wanted my money in this business, she was going to get my process along with it. Not control, not interference. Process. She nodded. She said she understood. I asked about her husband's role. She said he was handling the marketing, the social media, the front of house brand identity. I asked whether his name was going to be on any of the legal filings. She hesitated, then said, probably the business license, just to help with some of the administrative side while she focused on operations. I wrote that down. I told her I would fund it. But I told her how I would fund it, not in one transfer, not in a lump sum handed over on good faith. In three tranches, each one released after specific conditions were met. The first to cover the lease deposit and initial licensing. The second after the build-out was complete and passed inspection. The third after the first 90 days of operation with clean books delivered to me monthly. I told her I would need to be named as a secured creditor on a promissory note, properly drafted, with an interest rate consistent with what the Canada Revenue Agency considers arm's length. I told her I would need to review any lease she signed before she signed it, because I was considering co-signing if the landlord required it, which in this city, for a first-time restaurant operator, they almost certainly would. She absorbed all of this. Her hands were wrapped around her mug, and she was very still. Then she said quietly that her husband had some concerns about having too many outside voices in the business decisions. Outside, I was sitting across from my daughter, the person I had driven to piano lessons and university orientation, and her first apartment, and her husband had already decided I was an outside voice. I didn't react to the word. I simply looked at her and said, very calmly, that outside voices don't co-sign commercial leases. She didn't answer that. She looked at her coffee. I left the meeting having agreed to move forward. She left the meeting having agreed to my terms. We shook hands across the table like we were professionals, because in that moment we were. My lawyer drafted the promissory note. I reviewed it 3 times. When my son-in-law saw the document, he called me directly, not through my daughter, and told me he felt the paperwork was excessive for a family arrangement. I told him it wasn't a family arrangement. It was a business investment that happened to involve family. He laughed, not meanly, but with that particular dismissiveness of a man who finds a woman's standards inconvenient. I thanked him for calling and told him the note needed to be signed before any funds moved. He signed it. They both signed it. The first tranche went out in November, the second in February after the build-out passed its inspection. I went to see the space that day, stood in the middle of the dining room while the contractor walked me through the work. It was beautiful. The bones of the place were right, the lighting was warm, the kitchen was laid out with care. I felt something loosen in my chest. She had real taste. Whatever else was complicated about this situation, her instincts for the space itself were sound. I texted her that evening to tell her it looked wonderful. She replied quickly, happy, grateful, the way she used to be before her husband started managing the distance between us. I held on to that text for a while. After that, things got quieter. She was busy, of course. A restaurant opening in this city is not a gentle process. There are inspections and staff training and supplier relationships and 100 small crises that arrive without warning. I understood that. I didn't expect daily calls, but I noticed when the calls stopped altogether. I noticed when my texts started getting answered hours later, in short sentences, when they got answered at all. I noticed when she stopped asking for my opinion on things she used to ask about and started mentioning, casually, that they had it handled. We had a handle on it, that phrase in her husband's voice delivered to her mouth. I kept releasing the information to myself slowly, the way you do when you don't want the whole picture at once. I told myself the silence was circumstantial. I told myself opening a restaurant is brutal, and she was just tired. I kept the monthly reports coming because they were written into the agreement, and she honored that much, but they were brief, and there was a flatness to them that felt managed. Around week 10 after opening, a friend of mine mentioned she'd been to the restaurant with her book club. She talked about the atmosphere, the food, the service. She said it was lovely. Then she paused and said something that I filed away without responding to. She said she had looked for me in the room. She said she assumed I would be there, given what she knew. And she said she hadn't seen me anywhere in the photos on their social media either. I hadn't been to the restaurant yet. I said something vague and changed the subject. And when I got home, I sat down and opened their Instagram page for the first time in weeks. There were 72 posts since opening day. There were photos of the dining room full of people, photos of the chef plating dishes, photos of my daughter and her husband laughing behind the host stand, photos of the opening night with a crowd and champagne, and a caption about a dream becoming real. I scrolled back to opening night. I read the caption twice. It said, in part, that this had been built by two people who refused to let fear get in the way of something they believed in. Two people. I wasn't in a single photograph. I set my phone face down on the table and sat in the quiet for a long time. Not because I was hurt. I was hurt, of course I was, but I know myself well enough to know that hurt alone doesn't tell you what to do. What I was doing was reviewing, going back through every detail to understand the shape of what had happened, not the feeling of it, the shape. I picked up my phone again. I opened the promissory note. I opened the lease, the one I had co-signed, the one where my credit was attached to that property on Preston Street. I opened the CRA guidelines on family loans and the documentation I had kept since the first transfer. I opened the monthly reports she had sent me, and then I sat there until the picture became clear. I slept fine that night. I've noticed that happens when I've made a decision. The uncertainty is what keeps me awake, not the action. The morning after I opened everything and reviewed it, I called my accountant and then I called my lawyer. Not to complain, to confirm. I needed to know exactly where I stood legally, in writing, before I moved anything. My lawyer was measured as he always is. He confirmed what I already knew. The promissory note was airtight. The co-signing arrangement on the lease made me a party to the property contract with standing to request documentation of financial performance from the lessor's perspective. The monthly reports were technically compliant, but thin, and he noted that if I had reason to believe the business was taking on liabilities I hadn't been informed of, I had grounds to request a full accounting under the terms we'd agreed to. I had grounds. That's all I needed to know. I made one more call before I did anything else. I called my daughter, not to accuse, not to confront, just to give her the opportunity I wished she had given me. I told her I had seen the opening night posts. I told her I was glad the room had been full. I told her I wanted to come to the restaurant. I wanted to see it properly, as a guest. There was a pause on her end. Then she said that sounded lovely, and they had been so busy, and maybe in the next few weeks when things settled. I said, of course. I said there was no rush. There was a softness in her voice that I recognized. It was the softness of a person who knows they have done something wrong and is hoping the conversation won't go there. I didn't go there. I thanked her and said I'd let her pick the date. She never picked the date. 14 days later, I paused the automatic mortgage support payment that had been going to their account since 6 months before the restaurant opened, when they had moved into a house that was, to be direct about it, beyond what their income at the time could comfortably support. That payment had been my quiet accommodation to the gap. It had been voluntary. It had never been discussed as permanent. It had simply become expected. I paused it on a Wednesday morning. I made myself coffee, and I paused it, and I felt very little drama about it, which is how I knew I had waited the right amount of time. The call came before noon. It was my son-in-law, not my daughter. He called from a number I'd saved under his name, and I let it ring once before I picked up. He didn't say hello the way people say hello when they're calling casually. He said it the way people say it when they want you to know they're not happy but are trying to sound controlled. There was an edge in his voice wrapped in politeness, like a blade inside a napkin. He said the mortgage payment hadn't gone through. I said I was aware. He said there must be an error. I said there was no error. There was a pause. I could hear him recalibrating. He had come into this call prepared for a technical problem, not a position. He said they were in the middle of a very demanding period with the restaurant and that this was not a good time for complications. I said I understood that running a restaurant was demanding. I also said that the payment had always been voluntary support, not a contractual obligation, and that I had decided to pause it while I waited for a few things to be clarified. He asked what things. I told him I had some questions about the financial reporting and that I would follow up in writing. His voice changed then. The blade came out of the napkin, he said, with a careful steadiness that I recognized as practiced, that he hoped I wasn't going to make this difficult. He said my daughter was working incredibly hard. He said they didn't need this kind of pressure right now. I said I hoped my daughter was well. I said I looked forward to seeing her soon. He asked when the payment would resume. I said I would be in touch. I ended the call and wrote down everything he had said, with timestamps the way I was taught to document client conversations 30 years ago. My daughter called that evening. Her voice was different from his, not controlled, actually shaken. The kind of shaken that comes when someone has been crying and has stopped but not recovered. She asked me what was going on. She asked it quietly, like she wasn't sure she wanted the answer. I told her the same thing I had told her husband, that the support had always been voluntary, that I had some questions about the reporting, that I wanted us to talk in person without her husband on the line. She went quiet. I asked her when she had last looked at the promissory note. She said it had been a while. I asked her whether she remembered the clause about material emissions, whether she remembered that if I believed the financial information I was receiving was incomplete, I had the right to request a formal accounting. She said she remembered. I told her I didn't want to use that clause. I told her I would rather sit down with her, just us, and talk through what the last few months had actually looked like. I told her I loved her. I told her that wasn't in question for even a single second. But I told her I needed her to understand that I had signed a lease on that property. My credit was attached to that building, and I was being asked to continue supporting a household I had been quietly removed from without any acknowledgement. She didn't answer immediately. When she did, her voice was smaller. She said she hadn't seen it that way. I said I knew. We met on a Saturday morning, just the two of us, at a restaurant on Bank Street that neither of us had any connection to. She arrived first. She was sitting with her hands around a glass of water when I came in, and she looked like she had been awake for most of the previous night. I sat across from her and I didn't say anything for a moment, because sometimes the most respectful thing you can give someone is a few seconds before the hard part starts. She spoke first. She said she was sorry I hadn't been at the opening. She said it had moved quickly and decisions had been made and she hadn't. She stopped. Started again. She said her husband had felt strongly that the opening should feel like they had done it themselves, that having me there, visibly, would undercut the story they were trying to build. The story they were trying to build. I asked her if she believed that. She looked out the window for a moment. Then she said that at the time she had told herself it made sense, that she had wanted to protect what they were building from the appearance of dependence. I said, gently, that she had not been protecting herself from the appearance of dependence. She had been protecting her husband from the knowledge that she had needed help. Those are different things. She looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw something shift in her face. I told her I was not there to dismantle her marriage. I told her that was not now and would never be my business. But I told her that I had put my name on a legal document for that restaurant. I had put my financial history on the line so that she could get a commercial lease in this city, and I deserved, at minimum, to not be written out of the story as though I had never been part of it. She said quietly that she knew. We talked for 2 hours. By the end, neither of us had resolved everything, but something real had been said, and we were both still sitting at the table, which meant more than I can explain. What happened after that was not dramatic. Dramas for people who need an audience. What happened was procedural, which is the only kind of consequence that lasts. I requested the full accounting my promissory note entitled me to. My lawyer sent the formal notice to both her name and the business address. My son-in-law called twice after that, each time with a slightly different version of the same argument, that I was being punitive, that I was weaponizing paperwork, that I had never intended to be a real investor and was now using the fine print as an excuse to control them. I let him say all of it. I didn't argue. I simply waited for the accounting. When the records came through, my accountant went through them. The numbers weren't fraudulent, they were careless. There were expense categories that hadn't been reported, a line of supplier credit that had been opened without my knowledge, and a catering contract that had been negotiated using language that created a potential liability I had never authorized. Nothing that couldn't be corrected. Everything that needed to be addressed before the situation became something much harder to unwind. My lawyer reached out to their lawyer because by this point they had their own and proposed a structured correction process, a financial oversight arrangement, quarterly reporting to a third party, my formal removal from the lease co-signing arrangement once they had established 18 months of clean financials that would allow them to qualify on their own. My son-in-law's response through his lawyer was that this was an overreach. The landlord's response, when my lawyer contacted them directly to clarify the co-signing arrangement and my interests as a guarantor, was considerably more cooperative. Landlords in this city take guarantors seriously. They scheduled a meeting within the week. My daughter called me the night before that meeting. Her husband was not on the call. Her voice was flat, not angry, just tired in the bone-deep way of someone who has been managing something too heavy for too long. She asked if I was trying to humiliate her. I told her no. I told her I was trying to protect myself, which I should have been doing from the beginning, and which she had known I would do when she came to me asking for money, because she had known exactly who she was asking. There was a long pause. She said her husband had told her this would happen, that I would eventually use the money as leverage. I said that her husband had confused structure with leverage. I told her that leverage is what someone uses when they want something from you. Structure is what you build when you want to make sure something survives. I told her the difference was visible in the paperwork if she read it herself without his commentary. Another pause. She said she hadn't read it herself in a long time. I told her to read it. She called back the next morning before the landlord meeting. Not long, just a few minutes. She said she had read through everything. She said she understood now what I had put in place and why. She said she was going to come to the meeting. She came, without her husband. She sat beside me at a small conference table in the property management office, and she did not try to perform anything. She answered questions directly. When the property manager asked about the outstanding supplier credit, she explained it plainly. When the question of my co-signing continued standing came up, she looked at me and said, quietly, that she understood my position and that she supported the path to removing me from that obligation properly and on a documented timeline. I could feel her husband's absence in that room, not as a relief. It was more complicated than relief, but there was something clean about it, something that belonged to just the two of us. The oversight arrangement was formalized 6 weeks later. A chartered accountant, neutral, vetted by both parties, was engaged to receive quarterly reporting and flag anything material. The mortgage support did not resume. They managed. The first month was difficult, I know, because she told me so. The second month was less difficult. By the fourth, she called me one evening and told me, without being asked, that the GST remittance had gone out on time, that the food cost variance was finally within acceptable range, and that they had their first profitable month. She didn't sound triumphant. She sounded solid. I drove to the restaurant on a Thursday evening in early spring, a year and a half after the opening I hadn't been invited to. I had made a reservation under my own name. My daughter didn't know I was coming, or if she had any idea, she kept it to herself. I sat at a table near the window and ordered the tasting menu and a glass of Niagara Riesling, and I watched the room the way I watch rooms quietly, cataloging, noting the details. The service was good. The food was genuinely good. The kitchen had a rhythm you could feel from the dining room, a kind of controlled momentum that tells you the people back there know what they're doing. The dining room was full on a Thursday, which in this city means something. My daughter came out of the kitchen at some point, still in her chef's whites, and she saw me sitting there and went still for a second. Just a second. Then she walked over and she pulled out the chair across from me and she sat down, and she didn't say anything for a moment. I told her the duck was exceptional. She laughed. It was a real laugh, not a managed one, the kind that starts before you decide to let it. She covered her mouth and shook her head slightly and looked at me across the table with something in her eyes I hadn't seen there in almost 2 years. She said, not dramatically, not as a speech, just honestly, the way you say things when you're tired of performing, that she should have had me there from the beginning, that she had let someone else's fear of being outshone become her own decision, that it hadn't been worth it. I didn't rush to forgive or to comfort. I let it sit because the statement was real and real things deserve a moment before you respond to them. Then I told her I knew. I told her I'd known she would find her way back to herself because I had been watching her find her way back to herself her whole life. I told her the restaurant was beautiful and that she had built something worth being proud of. I meant all of it. We had dessert together, and then I put on my coat and I paid my bill the same as any other guest. She walked me to the door. Her husband was not there that evening. I noticed that too, and I chose to say nothing about it because there are things in a marriage that are not a mother's to navigate. On the sidewalk outside, she hugged me longer than she has since she was small. The street was quiet and cold in the particular way Ottawa streets are quiet and cold in early spring when the winter hasn't quite let go. I walked back to my car and I sat there for a minute before starting the engine. I had not gone looking for leverage. I had not gone looking for control. I had gone looking from the very beginning for a way to make sure that what I built and what she was building could both survive the distance that someone had decided to put between us. Some people think that money is power. I've watched money destroy families, create resentment by the wrong kinds of loyalty. Money on its own is nothing but pressure. What I had was documentation, and documentation doesn't care who it makes uncomfortable, it only cares what you agreed to. She thought leaving me out of the photographs meant she had outgrown needing me. She didn't understand that my name was still on the lease. I've been thinking lately about the moment Josephine sat in that restaurant on Preston Street and ordered the duck. Not the confrontations, not the legal letters, not the morning she paused the mortgage transfer. That specific Thursday evening, sitting alone at a table she had reserved under her own name, waiting to see if her daughter would recognize her across a full dining room. There's something in that image that stays with me because she didn't go there to make a point. She went there because she had earned the right to sit in that room and she was done pretending otherwise. What I keep coming back to is that none of what happened was really about money. The money was just the form the story took. What it was actually about was whether a person could be quietly erased from something they helped build, and whether they would let it stand. Josephine didn't let it stand, but the way she didn't let it stand matters enormously. She didn't make scenes. She didn't send accusatory messages or show up unannounced or try to recruit sympathy from people on the outside. She reviewed her documents. She called her lawyer. She requested what she was legally entitled to request. And she sat across from her daughter and told the truth without performing it. That takes something most people don't talk about when they tell stories like this. It takes a kind of moral steadiness that isn't glamorous, the kind that means doing the right thing, even when the easier thing would be to either blow up or go quiet. Her son in law thought he understood what power looked like. He understood visibility, narrative, the story that gets told in Instagram captions. What he didn't understand was the difference between the story and the structure underneath it. You can write yourself into a founding myth all you want, but if someone else's name is on the lease, the myth has a ceiling. And here's the part I find most worth sitting with. Josephine's daughter came back, not because she was forced to, because her mother had the clarity to hold a boundary without destroying the relationship in the process. That's not easy. That's actually one of the harder things a person can do. Stay firm about what they're owed while leaving the door genuinely open. It requires you to know the difference between your hurt and your position, and to act on the position without weaponizing the hurt. It requires real intelligence, not just cleverness. What stayed with Josephine through all of it? The silence, the erased photos, the phone calls from a son in law who thought paperwork was optional, was the understanding that how you carry yourself in hard moments is not separate from who you are. It is who you are. She didn't collapse into bitterness. She didn't go looking for revenge. She went looking for accuracy. And accuracy, eventually, is what brought her daughter back to her side of the table. I think about that sometimes when I'm tempted to confuse noise with strength. Josephine never raised her voice. She didn't need to. She had documentation, and her daughter, in the end, had the courage to read it.